What is up, guys? It is your friendly neighborhood weeaboo here, coming at you once again, this time with a review of the 1998 release, Andante, by Jun Matsuda. This is an album. This was her first album. And before I actually get into this, I owe a shout out to one of my subscribers, at least that's what YouTube tells me. Ian Manilis 5542 for shedding light on this, on the fact that this was available for streaming less than a week ago as of recording this, and I actually found that it's also for sale on DVD, on CD, through like Amazon. Of course, you can stream it on Amazon and like CD Japan, and so that's pretty cool. Looks like this album is just getting like one giant re-release, and I can kind of understand why. Andante it has to be like, okay, so 90s nostalgia is kind of a new thing for me. I didn't really, I guess it all kind of started, was kind of influenced by someone that I used to spend a lot of time talking to, who is like kind of lives in like that 90s nostalgia sphere, because that's kind of like when he around the time he like went to high school and stuff. Kind of in the same generation of kids as like Brian from Regular Car Reviews. A little older, but you know, around that same time anyway. And he kind of passed that on to me because I started like checking out movies from the not Japanese movies specifically from the 90s, and it's just a really interesting decade. I mean, a lot of the content that I've covered over the past couple of years, if you haven't noticed, has been a lot of like 90s Japanese material. I mean, even April Story, a movie from 1998. And I've also talked about Jun Matsuda's own gravure DVD from 1998, and this album is also from 98. I guess 98 is just like a really good year. I have no idea. And the thing about Andante that is really interesting, that really makes this album just enjoyable, is it is, you know, when I talked about Ogura Alice and her song For Friends, it's a very idle sounding song, or at least an approximation of such, from the early 2000s, right? That came out in 2003. So, you know, it's a little newer than this album, but this album, like musically, sonically, follows along very similar lines, except it feels a little more futuristic. Rather than being strictly of its time, there's a lot of stuff in here. Well, not a lot, but there are a few things in here that kind of feel a bit ahead of its time. For example, there's one synth, as if it's Star Wars. There's one synth sound in here that's really interesting because it's something that I'm used to hearing from like the late 2000s in Japan, like a decade later. Specifically, I'm thinking about Momoiro Clover and their song Ano Sorae Mukatte, which literally came out exactly like 10 years after this album was released. Some of the synth sounds in there are in a couple of tracks on Andante, and it's really, really interesting to hear that, because I mean, to me, Ano Sorae Mukatte, like, that's a song that, you know, is very much of its time, and so, at least in my mind, so hearing it here in 1998, it feels like it's looking ahead, you know what I mean? Like it's ahead of its time, which I know isn't the case, but it, you know, looking back retrospectively, you know, with the aid of hindsight, it's really interesting. It's a really interesting experience. But you know, a lot of these sounds sonically with these synths, like these sequenced instruments like the brass and some of the toned percussion and the sonic landscapes overall, especially in the ballads. It's like I remember like my earliest musical memories, like riding in the car like at night going back home or whatever after like spending the day with family on a Sunday or something like that. That's really like the vibe that I get from a lot of these, because that was just what was popular on the radio at this time. At this time in the late 90s and the early 2000s. You know what I mean. And it kind of like brings me back to like this really deep-seated like memory that aren't even really memories, but just more like a reaction, a feeling. I don't know how else to explain it, but it's just really interesting to listen to with that in mind. But one of the things that kind of takes you out of that 90s nostalgia feel a little bit are the vocals, believe it or not. And that's not a bad thing. What I mean by that is the vocals feel like 1988. Jun Matsuda has a great voice, just for like speaking also. I mean, if you haven't checked out the video where I played against her in Osama game and did horribly at, you would know that I actually mentioned that I liked the sound of her voice. And when she sings, it really does have that 1980s like J-pop, female J-pop singer. And the excessive, well, I don't want to say excessive because that sounds like a bad thing, but the saturated vocals and saturating the vocals in reverb, liberal use of that, really help push that 80s vibe. And what makes it extremely interesting is that this came out like pretty far removed from the 80s. The 90s had its own cultural thing happening. And so when you take the musical style, which is very much of the 90s, and then you take a vocal style of the 80s, what you end up kind of getting with this album is something that's almost the sonic inverse of First Time by Morning Musume, which I know is kind of a weird thing to draw a comparison to. But one of the things about that album, and I reviewed that a couple years ago, one of the main things about that I noticed is that the music itself is very much of, like, it sounds reminiscent of 80s J-pop. And then the vocals being as raw as they are, very much idol kind of, new age kind of idol, so to speak. New age in quotes, you know, it's kind of the new revival of idols in the late 90s. So the vocals are very much of the 90s, but the instrumentals are feel very much of the 80s. So this is the inverse, and it's a really cool experience. I have to say that this is probably an album that I can see myself actually buying a physical copy of in the near future. And then once I get my own car, again, I say again because I had one in America, but when I get my own car here in Japan eventually, and it has a CD player, this is definitely going to be something I listen to. And it's only appropriate that the cars that I'm looking at are all from the 90s, so it would be period correct. Favorite songs on here, I mean, it's hard. I mean, there are only 7 tracks on here, 6 really. There is a glockenspiel version of Koishikute at the end. It's only about 30 seconds long. But man, if I had to choose, gosh, probably my favorite song is Season. Like, if I had to choose only one, I would choose Season. That has such a great vibe to it. It's upbeat. It feels like a summer song. It feels like you could just cruise with the top down in a convertible along a beach or whatever. at like a medium pace and just listen to this the whole way. It's great. But Love Hero is great. Fall in Love, that's the song that kind of reminded me of my childhood a little bit, like early childhood, from like earliest memories. And of course, Koishi Kute is a really great song. I don't know, all of them are really good. Even To-Do-Do, which I think is really interesting because it's basically about like making a phone call. I mean, To-Do-Do is like the onomatopoeia for the sound that Japanese phones make when it's ringing, the other phone is ringing, you know. It makes a different sound than it does in America, in case someone was interested in that tiny aspect. But yeah, man, overall this album is great. I really can't get enough of it. I think it's worth checking out. It's only not even 30 minutes long. I think it's 28 minutes long. Yeah, it's not very long at all. It's definitely worth checking out. It's probably one of the best albums I've listened to this year, I think. I don't know. It's really good. Anyway, let me know what you thought about this album in the comments if you've listened to it before or recently or when it was new even. Let me know. And I'll see you next time with something different, something new. In the meantime,